All right. Thank you again for coming out to the presentation today. Really appreciate it. And so today's presenter is Vanessa Suarez. Vanessa Suarez is a senior policy advisor with Carbon 180, a national environmental nonprofit, where she spends her time advocating for science-driven and equitable federal carbon removal policy across natural and technological solutions. She is also a Public Voices Fellow with the Yale University program on climate change communication, where she uses her voice to discuss environmental and social equity considerations related to carbon removal. Prior to her current roles, Vanessa was an undergraduate student here at Clovis Community College. During her time here, she served as president of the Associated Student Government from 2016 to 2017. She also worked as a math and science tutor in the tutorial center. Vanessa graduated from Clovis Community College with an AA in natural sciences and an AS in biology before transferring to UC Berkeley, where she earned a BS in conservation and natural resource studies. And so I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa in 1 second, but Vanessa, are you okay with everyone with opening up the chat then?
Yes, please. There are a couple of questions I have for y'all that I would like to get folks engaged on.
Perfect. Perfect. So without further ado, Vanessa Suarez.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Patrick. And it is so wonderful to see so many familiar faces today. I can't tell you all how nice it is to be back at Clovis Community College. Today, I'm really excited to talk about environmental equity, justice, and what those two terms mean for California's Central Valley. But before I get started, I just want to take a moment to recognize a lot of the environmental justice advocates that work really hard day in and day out on a lot of the topics that we're going to be covering in today's presentation. It's thanks to the efforts of all of these advocates that work on the ground with Central Valley communities that our communities are able to get support for a lot of really important economic, social, and political needs. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'm going to share my screen. And also, let's see, right here. Okay, great. And I'm gonna turn off my video because I've been having weird connectivity issues today. All right, let's get started. Oops. So just quickly, this is going to be our agenda for today. I'll start by providing a background on environmental justice, covering what it means and the history of the environmental justice movement. After that, I'll discuss some of the environmental injustices that are occurring here in the Central Valley, covering their issues, impacts, and providing some examples. After that, I'll provide some high-level action steps to consider if you feel moved to stand up against environmental injustice after this presentation. And lastly, I'll have some time at the end to answer any questions that y'all may have. So to kick us off, I would actually like to get a little interactive with you all, despite being super far away on a Zoom screen. I'd like to take a minute and ask you all to think about what the term environmental justice means to you when you hear it. Once you've had a moment to sit with it, please type a response in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. And don't worry about right and wrong answers here. As we'll see in today's presentation, environmental justice honestly incorporates a lot of different components. I'm actually going to close this and open. Oh, I was not thinking. All right, the chat. Let's see. What are folks thinking for environmental justice? Okay, so I'm hearing doing the right thing for the future of our Earth. Equal access to clean water, clean air, pollution-free lands for everyone. Clean air and water for all communities. Anyone else? Looking at specific areas of our environment that impacted lower income populations.
Oh, I know many of you have put it into the chat and it's gone directly to me. So I'm going to read a couple of those, Vanessa, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Pollution reduction for all. Environmental justice is about the people who are most impacted by inequitable land policies. Everyone has access to clean water. Providing equal access to water, air, and employment. Greening low-income areas. So those are some that was sent directly to me. Again, you should be able to send the chat to everyone at this point. But yeah, those are a few that were sent to me directly.
Amazing. Thank you so much for reading those out loud, Patrick. And thank you everyone for giving those really thoughtful answers on what environmental justice means to you. I think a lot of what y'all have said really resonates with some of the more formal definitions that exist on environmental justice. So the official definition of environmental justice, according to the US Environmental Protection Agency, is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The EPA says that this will be accomplished when everyone enjoys the same degree of protections and equal access to decision-making processes that allow for a healthy environment in which everyone can live, learn, and work. What this means, basically, is environmental justice tries to address different forms of discrimination that are related to the environment and that disproportionately impact Black people, Indigenous peoples, and other people of color, as well as people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. However, that being said, it's important to note that several studies have identified race to be the singular most indicative component of environmental discrimination. So as we can see here, environmental justice isn't just about nature, it's also about race and economic backgrounds. I also wanted to briefly cover another term today that's arisen in more recent years, known as climate justice. So this term builds off of environmental justice, and it acknowledges that climate change will have disproportionate impacts on historically marginalized communities, like communities of color and economically disadvantaged communities, through social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts. Climate justice has implications at local levels as well as international levels. So we can think about global North versus global South countries, which are also referred to as developed and developing nations. I'm sure, as you can guess, climate justice at this level refers to the disproportionate and adverse impacts that climate change will have on global South countries, despite these countries having contributed the least to it. Environmental justice and climate justice both get used pretty often nowadays, especially in my line of work, where we work on federal climate policy. So, like we covered in the previous slide, the heart of the environmental justice movement is really focused on addressing historic and current racial and socioeconomic injustices. Despite being called environmental justice, the movement focuses on so much more. In the environmental justice movement, the use of the term environment was something really intentional, but it's not used in the way we normally think about the environment, like conservation of ecosystems or natural resources. In fact, the movement has actually expanded the scope of the term environment to also include the areas in which we all live, work, eat, play, learn, and pray. This expansion is because true environmental justice isn't just about protecting natural spaces. It's also about providing safe, good paying jobs, creating decent and affordable housing, supporting quality schools and recreation, ensuring democratic decision making, and so much more. All of these components that I just listed impact the areas where we work, eat, play, learn, and pray, and therefore the environment that we exist in. Moving forward, the environmental justice movement originally started with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. This act prohibited the use of federal funds to discriminate on the basis of race, color, and national origin. Around the same time, Dr. Martin Luther King's advocacy for civil rights also advanced environmental justice, with some of his efforts focusing on Black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. There have been notable cases in history of environmental justice following the Civil Rights Act and Dr. King's movement, like the 1969 lawsuit filed by the California Rural Legal Assistance on behalf of 6 migrant farm workers, which actually led to the banning of the pesticide DDT. Another case includes the protest of the Whispering Pines sanitary landfill in 1978, which was led by the Houston Northwood Manor subdivision residents. This protest showed that despite the Black population in Houston only making up a quarter of the Houston population, 100% of landfills and 75% of incinerators were placed in Black neighborhoods. Fast forward, and in the 1990s, the environmental justice movement really started to gain momentum. In October 1990, Robert Bullard published a book called Dumping in Dixie, which showed the struggle of Black communities in the United States against environmental racism and injustice. It was the first textbook on this, and it showed the clear link between environmentalism and social justice. And the following year, in 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held in Washington, D.C., and 17 principles for environmental justice were created that are still used today. And then let's fast forward again to today, and climate change has quickly become a priority for environmental justice organizations, leading to the term climate justice, like we saw in the previous slide. As I mentioned before, climate change is already having disproportionate impacts on historically marginalized communities, and this is only going to get worse as climate plans and targets continue to be delayed. Climate justice has also brought environmental justice to a global context, linking environmental and climate injustices experienced by marginalized groups from local levels to international ones. Unfortunately, climate change not only poses new burdens to these groups, but it will also worsen existing ones. Here are the 17 principles of environmental justice developed by the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. As you can see, some of these principles encompass access to natural spaces and green spaces, but it also targets labor standards, genocide, human rights violations, and a lot of other considerations that we don't typically first think of when we hear of the word environment. You can find these online at ejnut.org and more information about the summit. So on this slide, I wanted to provide some of the more recent cases in the environmental justice movement that are well known, at least at the national level. In the upper left-hand corner, we can see protesters at Standing Rock protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline through the reservation's water source, the Missouri River. These grassroots protests really put a national spotlight on the US's long history of harming Indigenous communities. These harms include threatening their sovereignty, violating treaties, depriving them of their land, and threatening their food and water security. In the upper right-hand corner, we can see water samples from Flint, Michigan and Detroit, Michigan being compared. The Flint water crisis, a public health crisis resulting from lead pollution in the Flint River, shows exactly what happens when local democracy and systems of accountability are completely disregarded by those who are in power. Unfortunately, the historically disadvantaged communities of Flint were left to suffer the health consequences without adequate support from their own local governments. And lastly, in the middle, we have a photo of farm workers in Oxnard, California, working in the field despite a nearby blazing fire. All throughout California, our farm workers have had to continue working during our worsening wildfire seasons, despite clear safety and public health hazards from the state's raging fires. While there are supposed to be standards for ensuring safety, state officials more often than not actually don't check if they're being followed. And many times, farm workers don't feel empowered to demand that safety regulations are met. This can be because of power dynamics, economic insecurity, immigration status, or other concerns. Not to mention, the majority of our farm workers are Latinos or other people of color who already suffer from other adverse public and environmental harms. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to dive deeper into what justice means and what the different types are. To better understand this, I wanted to cover three types of justice that are really applicable to environmental justice. The first type is procedural justice, and this gets at the idea of fair processes and who gets to be at the decision making table. An example of procedural justice could be ensuring that representatives from marginalized groups are represented, listened to, and given decision making power for land use planning in their community. The second type of justice I want to cover is distributive, which refers to how resources are divided and shared. But it's important that we don't only think about how benefits are distributed, but also how harms might be distributed and who's really bearing the brunt of the burden. An example of distributive justice could be a local developer working with a marginalized community to ensure job creation from their project is equitably distributed across their workforces as well as workforces of affluent nearby communities. And lastly, the third type of justice is restorative or reparative justice. And this refers to how previous injustices are amended or addressed. An example of restorative justice could be the United States providing technical and financial assistance to global South countries that are experiencing climate change impacts. And this is because the United States is the largest contributor to climate change. At more local levels, we could think about the role of large scale industries like oil and gas and the harms they've had on communities and how they might try to remediate these harms moving forward. To get a little deeper into the concept of justice, I want to briefly cover this graphic here, which I'm sure some of you may have seen before, or maybe at least some version of it. So, as you can see in the scenario, we have three people watching a soccer game, but at least one of them faces a barrier to being able to watch. On the left, we have a solution that is based on equality, which means that the solution assumes everyone is going to benefit from receiving the same type of support or accommodation. Clearly, this isn't true because one of the people still can't see the game. In the middle frame, we have a solution based on equity, which means that everyone gets support or accommodation based on their distinct needs. So the shortest person has the tallest box, the medium height person has a medium sized box, and of course, the tallest person doesn't require any accommodation or support. At first glance, this frame seems great. Everyone gets to see the game, yay! But we have to ask ourselves, did we really solve the root of the problem, or did we just slap a band aid on it? So then we move to the frame on the right, where we have a solution based on justice. In this frame, all three people can see the game without the need of any supports or accommodation because the inequity or the injustice was addressed. Now we've really solved the root of the problem. What this image shows is that while environmental equity is important in our journey in addressing environmental injustices that communities of color and low-income communities have been experiencing, justice has to be the ultimate goal of all of our efforts. It's only truly through justice that we can achieve a society that's inclusive and prosperous for all in the long term. All right, so now that we've dove a little bit into the background of environmental justice, let's get into what environmental justice looks like here in our beautiful home of California's Central Valley. So let's start at a high level. As some of you may know, the Central Valley actually suffers from the worst and most pollution burdens out of the whole state of California. Yes, there are other spots that have red and orange spots in California, like you see here, but it's not on the same magnitude that we have in the Central Valley. This map is a tool called CalEnviroscreen run by California's EPA, and it's used to help identify communities that are disproportionately burdened by multiple sources of pollution and with population characteristics that make them even more susceptible or sensitive to that pollution that they're experiencing. So as you can see on this map, the whole Central Valley basically is red or orange, meaning we have a cumulative pollution score between 80 and 100 if we use the legend on the left as a reference. That's 80 to 100 out of 100 total. So literally almost the worst possible score or the worst possible score. You can look up Cal EnviroScreen on your own on your computer if you're interested in learning more. You can type it into Google and it's run by Cal EPA. On the tool, you can even look up specific addresses. So for example, my own address where I'm here right now in Tulare, California is pure orange with the score between 80 and 90. That's not necessarily really great or exciting news. So I definitely recommend looking up what pollution burdens you may be experiencing in your own home or what your families may be experiencing. So there are a vast number of environmental burdens and hazards that the Central Valley is facing today. And these burdens and hazards impact our social, economic, and political livelihoods. While these burdens impact nearly all Valley residents, the degree to which their impacts are felt are distributed disproportionately across communities of color and low-income communities in the Central Valley. This level of impact can differ even within the same city, such as between North and Southwest Fresno, for example. In this slide, I've outlined 5 major environmental issues in the Central Valley, but this list is not exhaustive by any means. And in reality, many of these issues actually often impact each other or build off of one another. So as you can see, 5 of the primary issues of environmental justice currently experienced in the Central Valley are air quality concerns, water quality and water access issues, land use issues, the impacts of large-scale industries, and climate change. Starting with air quality. Air quality is a huge issue in the Central Valley, as I'm sure all or many of you already know. In fact, our valley suffers from the worst air pollution in the entire country. This pollution typically comes in the form of ozone or particulate matter pollution and its accumulation, which has impacts for our public health and our work and schools. There are 3 main driving factors for why our air quality is so bad and air pollution is so high. The first is because of our geography. Since our communities are sitting in a valley, the air gets trapped really easily and it doesn't allow for a ton of air movement. So when pollutants are added to the air, it all accumulates and just kind of sits there. The second is because of various sources of pollution in the valley. Things like emissions from vehicles, pesticide drift from agriculture, ammonia from dairy cows, emissions from oil and gas extraction, and more, all contribute pollution to the air we breathe. And like I just mentioned, all of this pollution ends up just sitting there and staying really stable in our air. The third driver, and an increasingly more important one, is natural disasters like wildfires. Wildfires are becoming increasingly destructive across our state, and they cause large increases in airborne particles and many gaseous air pollutants. So all of this horrible air quality, which is a result of the 3 drivers that I listed, has significant impacts on our public health. On top of having the worst air quality, we also have some of the highest rates of asthma for children and adults across the entire United States. There are also a number of premature deaths that happen every year because of poor air quality. And like I mentioned before, this impacts our school and areas of work. I know I can definitely remember days in high school when we couldn't go outside for gym because the air was so bad. Another really important environmental justice issue in the valley is water. Our Central Valley is experiencing more and more water stress. And what this means is that we're facing an inability to meet our human and environmental water needs. This is a really concerning issue and a reality we have to face because what happens when our demand for water is higher than what we have available? What happens when there's no water left? Our demand for water can be attributed to our valley's growing population, as well as demands for agriculture production and uses. Both of these factors put a huge stress on our water supply, and both are important because people need water to live and producers need water to grow. This issue has been really contentious and it's very difficult to navigate. And to make matters worse, recurring and worsening droughts in the state are lowering our available groundwater supply even more. On top of water stress, water pollution is another huge issue, and it's not always easy to pinpoint exactly what is causing the pollution. Some factors can include fertilizer and manure runoff from agriculture or pollution from oil extraction processes. Vulnerable communities in the valley, like East Arosi and Tulare County, currently live with contaminated, undrinkable water, and they have to resort to water storage tanks that are often provided by nonprofit organizations in order to be able to shower, brush their teeth, drink water, and be able to live healthy lives. Water stress and water pollution both have impacts on public health, and they can cause illnesses like cancer and organ damage, water security, or rather the lack thereof, damage to infrastructure, and the risk of running out of water. Land use in the Central Valley is another huge issue. Issues with land use usually result from the placement of different economic and cultural activities. In the valley, this looks like many different things. So, one example could be the placement of highways near low income neighborhoods instead of affluent neighborhoods, like the construction of Highway 99 that divides West Fresno from the rest of the city and subsequently experiences worse public health and environmental issues. Another example could be the placement of a dairy digester facility near a community of color that often doesn't have the resources to fight back that land use placement. Even the amount of trees or parks in one neighborhood versus another is a really important part of land use planning and an important topic of environmental justice. In 2015, East Porterville had dried up wells, and community members were left with little to no water access because of poor land use planning and infrastructure development that dated back to the 1960s. What happened was local nonprofits had to show up and fill up water storage tanks in order to help community members get access to safe and clean water. And while this is a water use issue, it also is compounded by land use planning and poor infrastructure development. So, as we can see, land use planning impacts public health and economic livelihoods. It can cause public health problems or exacerbate existing ones. It can lead to economic disenfranchisement. It can create a lack of access to natural resources like water or green spaces. And it can also create a lack of access to services like affordable housing. I'm sure, as many know, affordable housing is usually built in low income and already marginalized neighborhoods and not in more affluent communities, making it inaccessible to live in different parts of a city. Large-scale industries within the Central Valley and in general have also largely contributed to many environmental injustices. They've caused pollution burdens like contaminating the air, water, and soil of nearby communities and areas where extractive activities or activities in general typically happen. They also have a history of using unfair and unjust labor practices, especially for our migrant communities and workers in the valley. Two of the largest industries that are present here in our home are the oil and gas industry and the industrial agriculture. Kern County, for example, in the southern part of the Central Valley, is responsible for producing over 70% of California's oil, and this could continue based on recent permitting ordinances. All of these extractive industries have contributed to massive air and water pollution burdens in Kern County communities. Across the valley, on the industrial agriculture side, many migrant farm workers also face unfair and unjust labor practices in the agriculture field, impacting their physical, mental, and emotional health, as well as their economic livelihoods. Large-scale industries pose threats to public health, environmental health, and economic security for communities in the Central Valley. While they arguably can provide opportunities or benefits to the valley, the reality is that they are also harming our communities, and things cannot continue as they currently are. For environmental justice to succeed, these industries must considerably change the ways in which they function and actively engage marginalized communities on the ground in order to figure out a pathway forward that incorporates justice every step of the way and provides clear, tangible benefits for our Central Valley communities. And lastly, climate change. Climate change is already impacting the Central Valley, as in here and today, as well as the rest of the world. It's a global problem, but its impacts are felt from international to local levels. In fact, it's already starting to worsen many of the impacts that I've already mentioned in previous slides, such as droughts, wildfires, and many other issues. On top of that, it's also going to pose new challenges that Valley communities are going to have to face, particularly our marginalized ones. Some environmental justice impacts in the Valley that come to mind include higher temperatures and hotter summers, which will lead to more heat-related illnesses and energy burdens on households. We'll have longer and more severe droughts and declining snowpacks, which is going to increase our water insecurity, threaten our agricultural productivity, and put us in a position where we may not have access to water. More intense rainstorms are going to happen, which will result in more flooding. And while this sounds like it might counteract the previous two impacts that I just mentioned, in reality, it doesn't. And it actually could lead, like I said, to more flooding and potential water pollution. And then lastly, more frequent and intense wildfires are going to happen in the Central Valley as well as across the state. This will increase our air pollution, cause destruction to homes, to infrastructure, could cause death, and many more other problems that our Central Valley communities are going to have to face. It's important that we address climate change with justice in mind. All of these impacts are and will harm marginalized communities in the Valley more than affluent ones. We need to put safeguards and protections in place starting now to prepare for worsening impacts and what all of these impacts could mean for many of our sectors. So I wanted to engage with you all again after I've covered some of the issues here in the Central Valley and ask why you all think it's important to advance environmental justice in the Central Valley and beyond. And maybe Patrick, if the answers go to you, would you mind reading a few of them out for me, please?
Absolutely. The chat is open, so if you want to go ahead and answer in the chat, I can read some out. Waiting for everyone to type in here.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's the right thing to do. We have both a huge we have both a huge need and opportunity to ensure businesses will want to come to the Valley. There's an economic benefit in environmental justice for sure. So there's some of the answers that that are in the chat right now. Whatever happens in the Central Valley will cause impacts all across the country, especially with agriculture. That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Marginalization leads to more of a divide, more anger, etc.
Mhm.
Great answers.
Awesome. Thank you for reading those out loud, Patrick. And thank you everyone again for all of your really thoughtful answers. Since I made you answer, I'm also going to give an answer myself, which may be slightly long-winded, so bear with me. But I think this question is really important right now. And I'm going to tie it into kind of a lot of other issues that are happening in our world and our country. So our country and our world has been going through the COVID-19 pandemic for more than a year now. And this pandemic has been disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities. And then at the same time, we've also had many racial justice issues brought to light in this past year, including the rampant systemic racism in our police force, and frankly, all of our systems in general, and the impact that racism has had on the lives of Black Americans, including the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other victims of police brutality. These two topics may seem really different or distinct, but I think they actually both play really important roles in environmental justice and are really key components when we think about how to answer this question, because I think these two issues are reflected really loudly here in the Central Valley. Our own Central Valley was hit really hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you look at which communities were in purple tiers versus red tiers and other tiers, more often than not, our Black and Brown communities were the ones that were disproportionately impacted or had less access to vaccines or had less access to PPE or any other resources that we needed in order to take on the pandemic. And on top of that, systemic racism also runs really rampant in our communities here in the Central Valley. I'm not sure if you all are very plugged into what's happening in Tower District right now, but we have Proud Boys that are showing up and protesting, our communities and really threatening our safety and livelihoods. And so, what we really need is to build a Central Valley and a world, if we're looking at this question in the form of beyond, that doesn't discriminate, harm, and oppress Black people, Indigenous peoples, and other people of color, or put economically disadvantaged people in an even worse position. Everyone deserves the right to live, eat, work, play, and pray in a safe, clean, and prosperous environment. And I really like how some folks pointed out in their answers that we can see this almost as an opportunity in a way, because environmental justice allows us to center all of these marginalized groups while also providing economic opportunities and opportunities to revitalize our valley and create a future that's really inclusive and transparent for all. These environmental hazards have been happening for decades and decades, and climate change is ramping up, and it's only going to continue to get worse. We have a really long fight ahead of us in order to ensure that environmental justice in our valley and in the world happens, but it's a fight that's worth fighting, because it's going to save our communities and it's going to save our people. And if we all get meaningfully involved now from the get-go, we can shape what these solutions are going to look like to these environmental issues and to these climate issues. And we can ensure that justice and equity considerations are incorporated from the beginning, and that we have representation from marginalized communities and marginalized groups, and that these solutions are made with everyone in mind, so that we really can make that environment for everyone to live, eat, work, play, and pray in as prosperous, safe, and healthy as possible. So that's my answer, but thank you all for your super thoughtful answers as well. I really appreciated hearing what you guys think. So now, if you felt moved in any way by this presentation to get involved in environmental justice here in the Valley, I wanted to provide these really high-level action steps that you can take. So the first is getting involved locally. And I think this is a really great way to promote environmental justice, because our local governments make decisions around land use, water and air regulations, agriculture, and many of the issues that I discussed today. As a human being with a voice, you actually have a lot more power than you think you have in order to shape the decisions that are going to be made in our valley. We also have a lot of eyes right now on us, from the state to the federal level, because of our agricultural productivity and a lot of other abundances that the valley provides. We have an amazing opportunity right now to make ourselves heard and make sure that we shape an environmental and climate future for the valley that takes into consideration a lot of the topics that I've discussed, and that they center equity and justice. A second action step includes volunteering and or working with some of the amazing local organizations that we have here in the Central Valley. So we have groups like the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, the Central California Environmental Justice Network, the Fresno Sunrise Movement, and more, that are all fighting for environmental justice. And they cover a lot of the different components that we talked about today. So agriculture, energy, land use, city planning. So if any of those specifically interest you, these organizations have a team that is working to ensure justice is centered in what's going on in the Central Valley. And these groups are super essential in supporting our marginalized communities and have already done so much of the work on the ground, and even have, participated in some of the examples of environmental injustice that I shared with all of you earlier. A third step can be as simple as sharing information and elevating important voices. We live in a world right now that is so connected by the internet. It is really easy to share information on social media or even have discussions with your friends and families and use other types of information sharing and communication in order to get across what justice is, why it's important, and how it can be integrated into environmental justice. And justice isn't, just something to think about for the environment. Justice can play into a lot of the different components that impact everyday life. So, having those important conversations and using your platform to elevate these concerns and making sure other people are informed and aware is a really important way to make sure we're all on the same page and we're all fighting for the same Central Valley's future. And then the last step for action that I want to share with you all is integrating justice into your own schooling and your own work. And you don't need to be an environmental science major to do this. So, as we've seen today, environmental justice touches on a wide range of topics, from city planning to agriculture to energy to social studies and so much more. And if you keep the three forms of justice that we covered in today's presentation, so, procedural, distributive, and reparative justice, there are ways that you can definitely find to integrate and weave those different considerations into the type of work that you do. I can say, in my own job, the field of carbon removal did not have environmental justice really integrated into a lot of the work that had been done historically, or at least conversations weren't really including environmental justice. And so, I get to work with really amazing people who have started these conversations and who are really changing the field. So now that when we talk about carbon removal, even though sometimes we're talking about, engineered technologies that suck, carbon out from the ambient air, there are ways to think about who's benefiting from these technologies, who gets a say in what these technologies are going to look like, and basically just helping building the future of what carbon removal is going to look like. So it may not always be very obvious at first, but there are definitely ways to figure out how to integrate justice. So with that being said, thank you everyone again so much for having me today. I really hope this presentation was helpful and insightful. I love the Central Valley so much. Its people, its environment, Clovis Community College, and I hope that we all can work together to make it a better place. So thank you all again for your time.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for an amazing presentation. Give Vanessa a round of applause. And then, of course, we can get to some question and answer. If you do have any questions, please send it to me in the chat, and I'll be able to read it for Vanessa. And so the first question that that I have is, can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you actually do for Carbon 180?
Yeah, definitely. So, like I mentioned, or Patrick mentioned at the beginning, I'm a senior policy advisor at a national environmental nonprofit called Carbon 180, and we work specifically on carbon removal solutions. So, carbon removal refers to the process of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere and then taking that carbon to either store it underground or use it for, making different products and services. And so, as a senior policy advisor, I work basically every day trying to figure out what policies are going to help make sure that these solutions can get off the ground and implemented so that we can meet our local, national, and global climate goals. And so some of this work can look like working with congressional offices who either want to learn more about carbon removal or want to introduce legislation on carbon removal practices. Other parts of this work can look like working with other environmental organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund on figuring out strategies for how to best promote carbon removal or answering really key questions. We don't know everything out there yet, but we're definitely trying to figure out how we can promote carbon removal in equitable and science-driven ways. And so, it's a lot of policy development, communications, and collaborating with people.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's fantastic. And for any students who are maybe interested in doing that type of thing as well, we do actually now have an environmental science associate degree for transfer. So I had to just put that plug in. You got it, John.
That wasn't the case when Vanessa was a student with us, but we do want to mention that, and not just the classes you take in biology and chemistry, but just some great opportunities that you have as a student here that then you can go to all kinds of other places with that associate degree for transfer.
I also want to say, I put my email in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see it. But I know when I was a student at Clovis, it was kind of hard sometimes to kind of figure out like, whoa, the environment is cool, but like, how do I get involved with it? Or like, what do I really want to do with the environment? And so, while I work on policy, there are so many different things that you can do with the environment. You can do communications, you can do science, you can do business. And so if you ever want to figure out how to like figure that out or figure out any other things about having a career in the environmental field, please feel free to reach out. I would love to help out Clovis Community College students.
Perfect. Thank you, Vanessa. And then, so going on to another question that we got from the chat. Has the new administration in Washington given you more hope for environmental justice?
Yes, so much hope. Actually, the Biden administration is probably the most ambitious administration on environmental justice out of all administrations historically, which is really exciting. So a lot of the executive orders that President Biden has passed really center environmental justice when we're thinking about tackling the climate crisis, as well as international efforts related to climate change and just the way that federal agencies are working. So a lot of the stuff that he's passed is making sure that a lot of the resources and efforts that federal agencies do go to environmental justice communities. So one example I'll provide is the Justice 40 initiative, which was part of one of his executive orders. And so this executive order basically says that 40% of all federal agency efforts and actions have to go towards disadvantaged communities. And these communities have to see 40% of those benefits or resources or whatever comes out of these actions. So it's really exciting. And, I'll say also like not just on the administrative level, but Congress is doing a lot too for environmental justice. There are so many bills right now in Congress that are focused on environmental justice or that center environmental justice within them. And they're having lots of hearings right now to talk with leaders of major environmental justice organizations or leaders from different environmental justice groups or socially disadvantaged groups and communities to figure out, what do we need to do in order to help promote justice, in order to make sure that your voices are heard, and to make sure that our actions are not continuing to harm your communities and just undo and redress a lot of the harms that have historically happened.
Thank you, Vanessa. And then another question is for a student who is interested in getting into the field. And I know that we talked a little bit about the new degree that we have, the associate degree for transfer in environmental science. What are some other things that students can do and participate in if they're interested in really getting into the field and helping with environmental justice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it sounds like on campus, there are a lot more opportunities than when I first started. So, I would definitely talk with Dr. Forbes and Dr. Dormady to figure out kind of what these opportunities are, because I will say personally, I am not as clued into them since I wasn't around when they started. But that being said, I think, one thing I did that helped me a ton was doing research. So Dr. Dormady and I actually did research on preliminary research on neonicotinoid pesticides in the Central Valley and kind of like their impacts on bee populations. And these pesticides actually have lots of implications for public health as well. And so, kind of getting your hands dirty with research is like a really exciting way to figure out if that's something that you want to do. I think there are lots of opportunities in climate change communications as well. So Mrs. Martinez, I don't know if you have any climate or environmental opportunities, but I can say figuring out how to talk about environmental justice is such a key messaging point, because being able to convey this information to folks who don't understand, who don't get it. There, unfortunately, are a lot of people who have lived very privileged and affluent lives, and they don't understand why, you know, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are having these issues, or why economically disadvantaged communities feel disenfranchised. And so figuring out how to communicate that effectively and get the point across is so important, because getting everyone on the same page in order to make progress is one of the most important ways that we can do that. I would also just want to highlight again some of the organizations that I mentioned in my last slide. So that's not exactly an on-campus activity, but there are a ton of volunteer groups and organizations that you can do in your off time to like help out with the environment. There are tree planting initiatives, I think, in some historically marginalized groups across Fresno and the Central Valley, as well as you know, helping out with things like access to COVID-19 vaccines, which, as I discussed in my presentation today, it doesn't exactly seem like an environmental issue at first glance, but does play really hand in hand with environmental injustices. So, you know, I think just being really proactive about figuring out what you want to do, and talking with people, you know, maybe there aren't always opportunities at first glance, but if you want there to be, you can definitely figure out a way to make them happen. And like I said, I'm happy to talk with anyone who has more questions. That was a very long-winded answer, and I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, actually, two more questions, and I got something in the chat from one of the students. Who would be the people and counselors to contact about the environmental transfer degree? I think it's such a wonderful question. Dr. Forbes, do you want to tackle that real quick?
Sure. I mean, you can call any of our counselors, use the website, get an appointment. I do recommending having a conversation rather than just signing up for things. And that's going to be very helpful. Of course, if you want to talk with any of us directly, I mean, Dr. Dormady is on the call today, myself, our emails are on there. And one of the things we love to do is just to help guide students in the right direction also, you know, from that perspective. For the first time, we have Bio 2, which is environmental science as a separate class, and that's on the books to register for this fall. So that's for the first time. We have the associate degree for transfer and now a separate class that's also environmental science. And you look under biology 2, because it's actually a biology class. So those are some specific things you can do, but I encourage you to reach out to somebody. And we're available even during COVID, remote, online, everything. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Forbes. And actually, two more questions. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Carlos Cervantes, who's an agronomist here in the Central Valley, who has a question. And Carlos, are you able to unmute yourself?
Sure.
All right, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Great presentation, Vanessa. You did an amazing job. And I'm really happy that we have someone like yourself, you know, who's looking into these problems, especially here in the Central Valley. Just because, you know, I personally live what the problems are. You know, I personally face these issues as you know, I'm in the farming industry, and I kind of wrote the question here, so I'm just kind of have to read it in a sense. But I know that we as farmers, we can benefit from certain incentives from the government, as if we start utilizing green energy like solar, you know. What about looking into incentivizing farmers who are using more sustainable practices like cover cropping, increasing the biology in the soil, reducing runoff, and reducing nitrogen leaching? Is there anything like that that is in the works? Have you heard anything like that? Because I think I wrote it here, I strongly believe that a great farmer will help remove, you know, carbon from the environment if it's a good farmer.
Thank you, Carlos, for that incredibly important question. That is a great question. So I am not so sure at the state level because I work on federal policy, but I believe California, if any state is working on this, is probably leading these efforts. So right now at the federal level, I can say that we are looking into incentives to pay, agricultural producers for implementing practices that sequester carbon, as well as provide a lot of different conservation benefits. So, increasing agricultural resiliency to climate impacts, or decreasing the amount of pollution that they provide or produce, and things like that. So it's still in the works. And I think a big conversation is figuring out how we do this. So do we pay farmers for the amount of carbon they sequester, or do we pay farmers just for implementing the practice? How do we make sure that we're paying farmers in a way that's equitable? Because, we have to think about large scale industrial facilities versus a small scale family owned farm that may not have the same resources or, ability to implement practices on the scale that a large scale facility could. There are a lot of different factors and things to consider. One thing maybe I've heard about in California that could be worth looking into is the Healthy Soils Initiative that is being spearheaded by the state government. They may have more information on that, but it's definitely in the works at the federal level. And I think what we need is to hear exactly from farmers, like farmers in the Central Valley, who have really key insights into how we can best form an incentive program and policy that's going to make sure these incentives are equitably distributed and really make sure that we are, addressing climate change and a lot of the pollution burdens that I mentioned.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Vanessa. And I'm only going to get to one more question. It's a question that I personally have, because we are a little bit over time. So, Vanessa, how has Clovis Community College and the student government assisted you on your journey in making such an enormous impact, not only in the Valley, but in this country?
Oh my goodness. I don't think I can give Clovis Community College enough credit. I think without Clovis Community College, I would not be in the position that I am in today. I learned how to find my voice at Clovis. I learned how to build relationships. I learned how to advocate for myself. I learned how to become, strict with myself, how to become professional, how to become really dedicated to my studies, how to figure out my path. Like I mentioned, it's really cool to think you want to get involved in the environment, but sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly how you want to get involved. And so, when I think about who I was before I started college, and then how much I was able to grow at Clovis Community College and really find a lot of these things that I mentioned, it really impacted the way that I was able to conduct and lead my life and my professional development and academic development at UC Berkeley in my current role, and probably from here on out. I really think Clovis was such like an influential part of my journey, and without y'all, I don't think I would be where I am today. So thank you all so much for helping me and for giving me this platform.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. We really appreciate it, and we couldn't be more proud of you. You're going on and doing some amazing things, and thank you for giving just a little snapshot of what those things are today, and really appreciate it. Again, thank you to everyone who attended. It is, of course, this presentation has been recorded, so we'll make sure that gets sent out to everyone. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you guys.